This is ESF Connected Live, the second of our programs for the year, and we're looking also forward towards the third in September. This meeting, we have two people presenting, the two winners of the Marjorie Boulton Fellowship for 2024, each of whom are involved with interlanguage between English and other languages. Our plan is to have approximately a 20-minute presentation from Hiba, then questions and answers from everyone who wishes to present questions. Then we'll move to our second speaker, Vito. Similarly, he will present for about 20 minutes and take questions and answers. And following those two segments, then we'll open questions to either of our presenters or general discussion among the people who are here. All right, I normally don't do long introductions, and I plan not to this time. I'd just like to say that we at ESF were thrilled to select Ibrahim in 2024 as one of the two Marjorie Boulton Fellowship winners. And I would invite her to present whatever details she would like to about herself and then about her study. So please begin, Hiba.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the generous support you offered me back in 2024 on this research. My name is Hiba Ibrahim. I'm a Jordanian, so technically an international student, PhD candidate in applied linguistics at York University in Canada. But I'm currently connecting with you all from my home country, Jordan. I'm basically finishing up my dissertation, still working on a few things here and there, but I'm hoping to defend by late August, so fingers crossed. And today I would like to present to you, a summary of the doctoral research that I've conducted, for my PhD degree, and that is titled "Together Alone in the Digital Wilds: Experiences of Intercultural Competence in Lingua Franca Virtual Exchange Among English as Additional Language University Students in Canada and Jordan." And here's a quick agenda of what I hope to cover today. Just basically keep in mind that I made it through research questions 1 and 2. I'm currently working on my last research question. So I'm going to share like very high level, points that I'm working through these days. So for those of you who are not really familiar with virtual exchange, it's an educational practice where learners from different cultural backgrounds connect online to collaborate, learn languages, develop intercultural understanding. It definitely takes, different, shapes and models across educational contexts and various forms. So it basically, I would say 3 decades ago, the field started or was founded, let's say, by applied linguists, and it was known as telecollaboration. And telecollaboration as a model of virtual exchange focuses on structured partnerships between classrooms in, let's say, 2 different countries. Teletandem is another model of virtual exchange where pairs of learners help each other practice and learn their first languages, basically developed in Europe, and is based in the pedagogy of learner agency. So there's really no teacher facilitation in Teletandem. It basically counts on small groups of learners to facilitate the tasks by themselves. And more recently, maybe you've heard of COIL, and that is the Collaborative Online International or Intercultural Learning, through which academic projects are integrated into courses. So these models, are basically either task-based or project-based. And eventually, regardless of the model you follow in virtual exchange, if you look at virtual exchange research, They all say that fostering intercultural dialogue and collaboration learning is one of the main goals that instructors and university administrators really hope to achieve through conducting those. Usually using synchronous and asynchronous digital tools, meaning live tools like Zoom or Teams, Skype, as it used to be, asynchronous digital tools like instant chat messaging via WhatsApp or social media or Google Docs. So the combination of these digital tools obviously are used to connect these students and help them collaborate on their tasks. And obviously, for those who cannot study abroad or don't get the chance to be, physically in other countries for studies, VE does show potential to create authentic spaces to develop intercultural competence and critical global perspectives in technology-mediated language learning. Now, when it comes to the context of my personal interest as an emerging interculturalist, there are a few issues in understanding and researching intercultural competence in VE research that actually inspired my doctoral research. Now, first of all, it's in IC or intercultural competence itself. It's not really that simple to identify and define. In applied linguistics, for instance, we see lots of different definitions of IC. For instance, Bergotti emphasizes this awareness of how individuals position themselves and are positioned by others in interactions. Michael Byram, who's kind of a lead theorist in intercultural competence in language learning, distinguishes between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence in a lingua franca. Claire Cramsch, back in 2011, 2016, focused really on the symbolic importance and the symbolic competence kind of aspect of intercultural competence, interpreting signs, navigating power, conveying meaning was basically what she really focused on in defining intercultural competence. Now, if you look at VE, that's an abbreviation for virtual exchange studies, you will see that lots of them report that learners are gaining factual and critical cultural knowledge, they develop interest in others, they shift attitudes, and obviously develop intercultural skills. Modalities such as video conferencing via Zoom and chat support reflections are reported also by researchers. Using the synchronous and asynchronous tools we just mentioned, and it's reported that, using the combination of this technology helps them to deepen the cultural discussion between them. However, if you still look at the same studies, you will see that there's a dominance of using very much traditional IC frameworks and models. And those models do not really seem to I would say, accommodate this technological shift, this virtual, space formation that we are witnessing these days in education. And obviously, then they overlook the complex social practices that digital tools afford. And that's, if you look at the research also, it tends then to essentialize culture because of the use of these traditional IC models through which they see culture as, like it's the national culture aspect, it's the ethnicity. So it doesn't really see then students beyond their national affiliations, which limits the recognition of internal diversity. However, if you look at, I would say, recent research on intercultural competence, and also in my personal view, obviously, as a researcher in this field, people now believe that IC should be seen as evolving, it's relational, right? There are some dynamics involved in shaping IC approaches like, Fred Dervin, the simplex model, interculturality model, to embrace this complexity of intercultural competence is very much important to really be brought to virtual exchange spaces. Especially if we look at, the use of English as a lingua franca, or also if we really want to invest in the multilingual resources of our learners, then we really then need to look into research that adapts this idea of interculturality and intercultural diversity and complexity in virtual spaces. And that's really what I'm hoping to do in my doctoral research, especially that we always see this dilemma of the dilemma of the native speaker of English or French or Spanish really dominating the research. So for me, using English as a lingua franca, I was also interested in seeing how students will basically be working around English and other languages that they speak, and how they would bring then their linguistic repertoire into the study itself. So that's what I said about, the importance of then seeing culture as dynamic, fluid, seeing culture and interculturality then as a process, not a product, and seeing it as relational. One of the important things of these IC models is that it really reports or kind of tells you on your own intercultural competence as an individual. While if we try to rethink culture and interculturality, especially in virtual spaces, we do need to consider these relational practices in order to better understand then how someone's culture or views of culture and interculturality then evolves in given the context of working with others and growing and evolving with others, especially from different cultural backgrounds. So in order to investigate or basically this phenomena, I'm trying to ask these three questions in my research. I'm interested in really looking into the intercultural interactions and collaborations that emerge within VE groups, the strategies that students use to navigate those interactions and collaborations, and really to what extent do they, evolve over time. Obviously, there are always, as in any VE, there are always dynamic factors that influence intercultural competence, interactions, collaborations. So I'm really then curious about looking into these dynamic factors that influenced the learners across the VE groups, and how then these, dynamics even were navigated by those groups during the VE. And finally, more of the theoretical aspect of things, I'm really interested then, the so what, right? After looking at these experiences, a very important question to me is then what do we learn then from these experiences in terms of understanding and shaping or rethinking the epistemological understandings of culture and interculturality, not just in virtual exchange as a pedagogy, but also in the wider technology-mediated language learning contexts. So for my research, I basically conducted my data collection back in 2022. This is just a summary for you to have a look at. But as you could see, I connected to, accredited English as a second language, additional language classes in Jordan and Canada. I had 13 participants who, consented to be participants in the study, but eventually I had around 24 students in Canada participating in the VE and also 19 students in Jordan. The methodology I used is basically, digital ethnography or some approaches of digital ethnography, and also multiple case studies. So, for data analysis, as you can imagine, I used qualitative thematic analysis to look into the small groups of students. So the group itself was my unit of analysis, looking at them and then hoping to then better understand the experiences of students by looking at this cross-case analysis, after doing the within-case analysis in each study. So for my data collection methods, I conducted a pre-study qualitative survey just to better to know, my students or my participants in the survey, to learn about any intercultural experiences they had in the past. I did observation of multimodal interactions and collaborative artifacts. This is actually through looking at the recorded video conferencing in these small groups, the video reflections they had, the interviews they had throughout the tasks, and which I will actually give you a look at in a moment. So I did an observation of everything they've actually done in this VE throughout the 7 weeks of the virtual exchange. And as I said, here's a really quick look at my participants. As you could see, I eventually, for my dissertation, and also to kind of showcase the divergent learning experiences and collaborations and strategies, I picked those 4 groups to report in my dissertation. I selected participants for interviews based on my observation of their intercultural behaviors and strategies and the decision-making they did throughout the exchange. And as I could see, not all participants in each group I was able to interview just because they did not consent to be a participant in the interview. But I managed to, observe their work, luckily, which enabled me to, have a better understanding of their experience as group members and also as individuals. Very quickly, this is basically the timeline of the virtual exchange, the type of tasks that they did. As you could see or notice, there's a combination of individual and group work that students did synchronously via Zoom and also asynchronously via a variety of tools of their choice, but also there were tools chosen by the instructors, such as Padlet, for instance. Students basically chose the social media platforms they connected through. So some groups, for instance, chose WhatsApp. I have one group who chose Instagram. So, there was also a culture hub Padlet, what we called the instructors called the culture hub, where students can choose to share about their cultural contexts and realities throughout the VE, but unfortunately, it was not utilized after week 1. So a very, very quick summary of the findings, especially for research questions 1 and 2, because those were, what I got to work on very thoroughly. The analysis revealed that group cultures were not predetermined or fixed, as you can imagine, but they evolved over time through the participants' interactions, the strategies, both individual and collective, that shaped, by their individual and collective responses, interactions, and also how they approach the challenges and affordances of their VE contexts. As you could see in the summary of the table, across the groups, learners deployed a range of intercultural strategies, including linguistic strategies, behavioral strategies, technological strategies, or let's say their approach of using technology to effectively connect with one another. To give you an example, group 1, for instance, it was really very clear that they relied on Instagram to have their personal connections. Even before they started the VE, once they learned that there will be, a group, they formed an Instagram group. They started learning about each other, each other's contexts, and it was a very interesting combination of a huge Chinese, so a Muslim Chinese, a Palestinian, Palestinian Jordanian. So this diversity in their background seemed to also kind of, motivate them to learn even more about each other. And they actually utilized Instagram not just to connect and schedule meetings, but for the entire 7 weeks, they just kept learning about each other, connecting, after tasks and follow up with questions on each other's like intercultural issues like occupation or discrimination. Other groups, for instance, used only WhatsApp to schedule meetings and just to share basic ideas. So you could see the divergent approaches to even using technology, not just to finish the tasks, but also to stay in touch, and how that then influenced the relationship building among groups. So the linguistic strategies, for instance, such as paraphrasing, simplifying language, humor, politeness, platform selection, were not only instrumental in managing tasks, but also in shaping the overall dynamic and culture of each group. In many cases, these individual strategies informed collective ones, contributing to group-specific ways of relating and collaborating. So for instance, in groups where you find, individual students who use humor as a communication style, you could see that they use that to initiate, collaboration. For instance, there were groups where you could see code switching happening naturally from English to Arabic and Arabic to English. And those people seem to have this kind of sense of leadership. Again, it was all from their survey and observing their behavior. You could see that, their personalities, identities, and, how they are as people obviously shaped their individual strategies and therefore collective strategies in shaping their group cultures. Ultimately, it was learners' agency, obviously, rather than the structure of the VE itself, that played the most significant role in shaping how intercultural engagement unfolded. Students' active and at time actually passive, responses and participation played a role in evolving those conditions of their group work. And it basically played a foundational role in how their collaboration and interaction developed. To give you an example, as you could see, Group 4 it was really funny because when you watch everything and you observe everything they did, oh my gosh, they're respectful to one another, they try to help each other. But then when you go back to the interviews, they backbite. They hated working with each other simply because this one person, their Jordanian partner, did not show up. It was not responsive. So you could see, very naturally and organically how students use sometimes some face-saving, mechanisms and neutral distance as a way to finish the tasks, but not for relationship building. And, just to, their goal was obviously just to finish this VE. They were not interested in building relationships or friendships with one another because it was just a headache for them. Um, so obviously, all of this happens because of certain dynamic factors that shape those interactions over time. And in this context of the study, of this VE, there are four dynamic factors that seem to play a major role in, influencing students' work in groups. Those were the instructor pedagogical choices for the VE implementation. One key thing I could say here, just to be mindful of time, is that during the summer period right before the VE, as a researcher, I connected with both instructors. I just facilitated the task design. I told them about the importance of intercultural dialogue, facilitation, and they agreed on facilitating or how they schedule facilitation of the tasks. None of that happened in the VE. So that's why students were actually left alone. And that's why for me, it was like, together alone in this virtual exchange, which is really not that common. But that was one of the major decisions and choices made by the instructors that kind of was very influential, and pretty much shaped lots of those dynamics and how these students then worked with support from instructors and how they then try to facilitate everything by themselves. As I said, participant identities, personalities, and evolving intercultural experiences played a role in shaping those cultures and particularly using collective and individual strategies in managing those dynamics. The use of English as a lingua franca was basically used as a shared ground for communication and intercultural bonding. It was very interesting to see that groups, for instance, you have group one and group two. If you want to compare them to groups 3 and 4, students in those groups saw the English as a lingua franca as a learning space or as a cultural space to invest in intercultural relationships and intercultural learning. So those who kind of viewed this language space, as also a cultural space of learning, you see that they deepened intercultural engagements versus groups 3 and 4, where they were just basically task-oriented. All what they focused on is just practicing English or just using English to finish these tasks, had this kind of surface level interactions with one another. So the findings then underscore the importance of affordances, which are technological, linguistic, and relational learner identity in shaping how and why certain strategies were used. Participants' perceptions of themselves as English learners, as I said, the way they even perceived the English language learning environment in the VE, the cultural representations, the task completers or their task completers or their representatives of their own national cultures. This all influence their communication choices, their communicative choices, and obviously the group dynamics. The analysis also shows that the central role of strategic agency, which is the student's ability to make intentional choices about how to communicate, collaborate, and relate to one another, is also very important to pay attention to. As I said, not all participants in this VE treated the language, let's say linguistic VE space as a cultural learning space, and those did not really demonstrate the same deep intercultural engagement as others. I'm currently working on research question 3, but I can actually share some of the, data or things that I'm working with right now. So obviously, dynamic understanding of culture is very important. Interculturality as co-constructed, the learner agency, this idea of insights from learners on how to shape interculturality or how interculturality actually is shaped in interaction and driven by strategic agency. Learners' voices are very important, and by voice, I mean also practices, not just what they share in interviews or surveys, but also looking at what learners are doing is very much important in reframing our intercultural competence understanding. One of the things that to be noticed in this study, and obviously given the fact that instructors did make certain decisions about, let's say, not facilitating the VE task between the students, you could then imagine that, there was some static cultural knowledge not gained by students. In other words, when you ask the students about, okay, what did you learn about the Jordanian culture? Like, what did you learn about, let's say, the Chinese culture? Or what did you learn about cultures in Canada? They're not going to be able to answer those questions fully. However, and that's, I think, what's very special about the study, and that is students still engage with the process of interculturality. They basically tried throughout the 7 weeks to adjust their intercultural strategies, to sometimes even negotiate those strategies with their members, with the group members. All of these linguistic, accommodations, for instance, they used whether it's code switching or, back channels, and that is like, like agreement tokens, and how they, for instance, use those to deepen discussion reveals the potential of learning agency in shaping virtual exchange learning experiences. So it's really sometimes, I think my point I'm trying to make here is what we perceive as cultural knowledge needs to change in virtual exchange context, especially those ones where we don't see instructors playing a major or like a very, let's say, pivotal role in um, you know, uh, facilitating the tasks or micromanaging the tasks among students. There's still work that is happening. Students still figuring out, ways to work around opportunities and challenges for intercultural growth. And as you can then see, these experiences challenge essentialist models of intercultural competence. Particularly the common ones used in VE research are Michael Byram's, the saviors kind of dimensions of intercultural competence, and Darla Deerdorf's, process model of IC. Um, they basically do, as I said, acknowledge the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes and the internal, let's say, processes that happen, but it's still within the individual. They're not looking at IC as relational, as dynamic, as the more recent views of, interculturality that I pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, or even other frameworks that are now called the critical virtual exchange, where, for instance, translanguaging is a norm, right? Where this idea of power dynamics, authority, authoritative leadership, etc., are pretty much important factors to better understand how students then achieve or work towards intercultural growth. So again, I'm working with these ideas right now to see what those particular experiences in this VE teach us about the static versus dynamic views of culture. And obviously, as you could see, they're going more towards the dynamic view of culture where, um, you know, uh, we should move from the static essentialist views of culture, and that is, I'm Jordanian, you're American, you're Chinese, you're Canadian, to a place where culture is seen as, more dynamic, a process, and it's a relational understanding again. It's not just me, the individual, it's a relational understanding, and it's a process. So thinking again of Fred Dervin's Simplicity and Interculturality Framework, Francesca Helm's, for instance, Critical Virtual Exchange Framework, the findings show that learners' strategic agency shaped intercultural practices. It helped them build relations to bridge through that they bridged through code switching, empathy, nuanced meaning making, and this way then culture is co-constructed in the VE environment. It's not, like defined. Again, it's not static. And it goes beyond the simplistic checklist of like cultural competence, to more lived, active, evolving experiences. And that's why, for me, in this particular research, I actually see the findings leading me to think to move from intercultural competence to intercultural belonging and intercultural becoming, to basically, encompass all of these, concepts that emerged in the VE experience. We should maybe think then of um, those relational practices more often rather than just reporting on individual, let's say, pre and post survey responses that show us individual students and how they, did in the VE. Also, implications for practice and future inquiry that I'm still working on dissertation-wise for the discussion chapter, but also obviously as a practitioner and a researcher of VE. For pedagogy, obviously, we need VE tasks that help students scaffold relational, critical, and reflective interaction. Instead of just viewing them as group tasks versus individual tasks, it's important to have them, reflect with one another as a group, negotiate their progress together, for instance. Fostering inclusive spaces that validate linguistic and cultural hybridity is also very important. It was very interesting, for instance, to see that within these groups, in 3 groups, code switching happened very naturally and organically, and it was even accepted very organically and naturally, versus in group 4, students disliked code switching and they actually saw it as a challenge to work with because it's not helping them practice, English enough. I think with more, let's say, instructor facilitation, if they had instructor facilitation, they would have, come to realize that it's no, actually, something that we as individuals and we as bilingual and multilingual speakers have, and it's totally fine. It's part of the learning process to use our languages, for instance, in those exchanges, in our learning experiences, especially in virtual spaces, where students, seem to use and be creative about those semiotics that the multimodality of the virtual space really offers them. And obviously, we need as researchers and also, educators to recognize students as co-constructors of intercultural knowledge. As I said, if we only want to see the culture and knowledge or perceive it as we do traditionally, people might tell you, well, these students really did not, they came out with like zero cultural knowledge. But if we then see them as formers and co-constructors of the process of interculturality, that's going to really change a lot. For future research, obviously we need longer, kind of more longitudinal studies to explore effects of VE on identity and intercultural agency. We definitely want to investigate VE across diverse linguistic pairings and geopolitical contexts. One of the interesting things that I noticed in those groups is that, again, because the majority of the students in Canada were Chinese, as you can imagine, coming from certain cultures sometimes or certain understandings of the world would really impact, students' performances, let's say in pedagogies like VE. I personally am really very much interested in maybe like having more VEs with students coming from contexts that, might call reserved when it comes to learning about intercultural issues and global issues, and see really what we learn even more from those geopolitical contexts. And again, like if we had more facilitation of that type of learning, what are the things that would come out, within those, let's say, VE groups? And finally, examining power dynamics is always important in understanding digital intercultural learning environments. And I say this because, for instance, in some groups, you see that students used more kind of flexible co-leadership approaches versus some other groups who seemed, the leaders of the group seemed to be a little bit more authoritative, right? And like more kind of formal leaders of the group. Obviously, this gives and restrains lots of learning opportunities. And that's why going back even to Cram's, symbolic competence, by investigating power dynamics and having students really reflect and scaffold power dynamics within their groups would definitely help them raise more awareness about, the opportunities and challenges they create or are created by those power dynamics and, become more aware of it. One of the interesting things that I would like to report on in my dissertation is how the research itself, like the study, let's say the study interviews, um, played a role in raising awareness among students. Like in my second interview, I would have some participants say, after you and I talked the first time in that interview, it made me realize one, two, three, and four. It made me really reflect on one, two, three, four. Um, and again, I think with the limited facilitation from the instructors, they found that as a very, like valuable, maybe learning opportunity for them to, again, scaffold and reflect and, keep bringing those little pieces that they're not really maybe aware of when they're actually doing the tasks. So that's really where I am. And that's, as I said, what I'm hoping to finish before August. Here are some references, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry if I took a little bit longer than expected. Thank you.
Oh, I thank you. I think that we gained a greater understanding and the more complete overview since you gave us a little more extra
Thank you.
uh, details at the end. I think it would make sense to use well, it would make sense, as Chuck is doing, to offer our applause, virtual or otherwise, for this lovely presentation and valuable, meaningful presentation. We welcome questions and comments now.
Thank you, Hiba, for that really interesting presentation. I enjoyed it and learned quite a bit. Just one, I'll ask a very, I think, straightforward, practical sort of question. I think any of us who are teachers recognize when you told us about your results with the 4 groups, we recognized how some of the groups were great, it seemed like, and some of them were not so great in terms of the outcome. I mean, that was sort of just impressionistically. The first 2 groups seem to have all the characteristics that you would want. The second 2 groups seem to be more sort of doing the tasks, but going through the motions. So first, I don't know if you agree with that characterization, but to the extent that you do, I'm just wondering, like, what, from the teacher's perspective, is there something the teacher can do to encourage groups to be more like groups 1 and 2 and less like groups 3 and 4?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Hiba, the teacher, will answer this question, and then Hiba, the researcher, will also answer the question. So from the research point of view, it's very common to see VE research referring or describing students' intercultural experiences the way you just did, and that is negative and positive, good or bad, right? Like maybe advanced or novice, etc. What I really try to do in the way I looked at the data and the analysis in the study is, and I think that's also part of this simplicity, framework, which basically means that your intercultural journey is not always simple and it's not always complex, right? Like it's a mix of both. And basically looking at, for instance, groups 3 and 4, there were moments of some kind of depth, let's say, of intercultural learning. But Hiba, the teacher, will say this is actually when, for instance, you would see the instructor facilitation being missed. Like if students, and all of these students, I mean, obviously in group 1, for instance, there were moments where students did not seem to know exactly how to empathetically respond to each other. Let's just give you an example. As I said, one of those group members was a Palestinian, and she just moved to Jordan. She was telling, her members about living under occupation, etc. What the other member, he kind of said, "Oh, but you're in Jordan. You're fine now. You're safe." Although she knew that, he did that just to comfort her and as a way to show compassion and empathy, she didn't like it. She was like, "Oh, well, I don't want to I don't want to be felt sorry for. This is not why I'm sharing the story, etc." If, for instance, after watching that recording, if the instructor came in and kind of reflected with the students on, those learning experiences, maybe paused and said, "Oh, looking back now, what would you say, for instance?" Things like that, this could have really deepened the discussion more for everybody. I mean, obviously more for groups 3 and 4, right? Where students obviously needed extra instructors, support from their instructors. But again, from a research point of view, it's all intercultural learning, right? They're all on a very different point of their intercultural journey. One of the things that I asked my students, all of them actually, I would say in the second study interview was, what did you learn from this virtual exchange experience? Assuming that if you're to participate in another virtual exchange, what would you change? What would you bring? What would you do? And everything they shared, obviously they shared from the challenges as they shared from the opportunities. For instance, students in groups 3 and 4, you know, in group 4, as they used politeness a lot, right, as a face-saving mechanism. One of the two students in Canada said, next time I would just be more courageous to confront my partners and, talk about how we could do the work better, for instance. So for me, that's still intercultural learning, right? That I hope, that they carry to, let's say, future virtual exchange or even like in person, sometimes intercultural experiences. So definitely teachers, and that's actually key in virtual exchange. And you'll see this in every single VE study you read, and that is facilitation is important. Bringing the online offline in the classroom is very important. And that's really how then you help students look at conflict or moments of distance, like for instance, what happened for 3 and 4, as learning opportunities, things to learn from, and to carry with them for let's say future meetings with their group members. So that's, I think, I hope I answered your question. As I said, just to sum up, this is all part of the intercultural process, of the process of becoming intercultural, right? And it's different experiences because we're different people, we have different personalities, different cultural backgrounds, different intercultural experiences. But that's why the role of the instructor is very important in helping students scaffold those. And I think what's really important, and we're still missing in VE, look at conflict and tension and misunderstanding and miscommunication as an opportunity to learn from rather than, a moment to avoid, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba.
You're welcome.
We have 4 remaining questions queued so far. The next one up is David Jordan.
Let me lower my hand here. One of the, I didn't clearly retain, I won't say I missed, I just didn't clearly retain some of your description of these groups at the very beginning. I gathered these are all college students.
Mhm.
The college students that I teach, I'm in California, you would expect they're all Anglophone, and it's an Anglophone university. About half of them use some language other than or in addition to English at home. This makes them a very, very linguistically diverse group, and they tend to live in little clusters of about 8 students in a configuration in a dormitory, so that the chances are that you are already living with students who are quite different from you. And the reason they speak these different languages at home is because their parents are immigrants or their grandparents were, and California is a center for all kinds of immigration coming in. So that means, in some sense, these students are already kind of intercultural and have intercultural experience in a way that another population of students is different. I'm thinking of your students in Jordan, for example, who may be bilingual in the sense that they're using both English and Arabic, but whose experience is sort of less diffuse. So that the issue is, one wants to know a little bit more about who these students are on each side, and particularly the difference between the Jordanian bloc and the Canadian bloc. But another thing happens, and that is that over the course of living together, from the time they arrive in the fall to the time they depart in the spring, they're having experiences interacting with these other students. In the fall, they're also very, very eager to make contacts, because particularly the ones who have just arrived or they're just configured. So they're eager to become friends. Everybody's out there being very friendly. Everybody's willing to be friendly with everybody else. By the springtime, they're much more closed social groups, and they're much less open to new contacts and so on. They're establishing their groups. So the time of year seems to make a difference when your population is college students. So I'd be interested in your observations about how your Jordanian students were different from your Canadian students, and have something about whether there's any evolution that you see that's related to the extra study, the outside the study, evolving relationships of interculturality among these students.
Mm.
All right, I've talked too long. Sorry.
No, that's a really important observation, and obviously, you see it a lot in study abroad or virtual exchange programs. Just to kind of orient you again around the participants. So the Jordanian students slash Palestinian Jordanian students, like in nationality Jordanian, they were all first-year students, majoring in different, disciplines. They were not technically Canadian students in Canada. They were mostly Chinese students, so international students studying in Canada. So they're international students. That's why English here is used as a lingua franca, right? Basically, they're older than the Jordanian students. They, very similar to your college students, they emigrated with their families to Canada at the age of 14, 15, 16, 18, etc. I think what's very, by the way, I think up until now, this is really the first research study that brings Chinese students with Jordanian students in VE. I haven't really read this, about this context in the research so far. I think it was a very unique combination of students, because you could see if you look at the Chinese participants, even in Canada, you would assume they're intercultural by now, because they've at least lived in Canada for 10 years, they've been exposed to multicultural Canada, etc. But it was moments and tasks and interactions they had with their Jordanian students that still reveal to you that there's obviously still a lot for them to learn, especially that this is for actually most of them the first time they connect with somebody from the Middle East, particularly Jordan. And I think that's one of the observations, even by students themselves, especially the ones in Canada, who said to me, although we live in Canada and we work with, Canadian and non-Canadian, white, non-white students, this was very different in a way that it exposed us to areas we've never realized we need, or we don't know much about, if that makes sense. So I think, and that's actually maybe one thing that we can bring to discussion in research, and that is assuming someone being intercultural just because they're bilingual and multilingual, or because they come from, a multicultural background, is not always accurate, I think, or helpful, if you want to put it this way, in situations when especially they work with cultural differences they've never, they're not acquaintance of, they've never dealt with before. At the same time, this actually brings you to seeing that because of those cultural differences, because of those very big cultural differences, students either got really excited to learn about their partners and connect with their partners. I had students actually spending hours before and after, let's say, their Zoom meetings to finish the tasks, just to connect with one another. I had students connecting with their, each other's families, groups 1 and 2. But you also had those who were really afraid, and it was pretty much very clear from the beginning, even in their pre-study survey, they seemed to be very scared to engage with cultural difference. And there were different reasons. Some refer to the idea that they don't follow a particular religion, and that after the first meeting with their partners in Jordan, for instance, they realize that they are Muslim, or they wear the hijab, or etc. And again, this is what brings us back to the scaffolding of learning, to helping students really learning about each other. And I totally agree. I think one of the things that are limiting in virtual exchange sometimes, especially if you're not really funded very well as a researcher to conduct these projects, is that they're not longitudinal. Like it's very, very rare to see a virtual exchange extending for more than just one semester. Very rare. So as you just mentioned, you really want to invest lots of time and effort as an instructor, let's say in the beginning of the virtual exchange, to help students learn about each other. And that's why, for instance, that culture hub Padlet was created. Different things were created, but again, because of the schedule of the students, the busy schedule of the students, when the VE happened, for instance, the Jordanian students were just starting their academic year. It was actually after reading week for for students in Canada. So they were kind of coming towards the end of the year. That was a big challenge to work around, right? So I hope this answers your question in some form. But again, I think every context is very special, and every context is really important to pay attention to, and pay attention to its dynamics and its different dynamics. Because as instructors, then we could find opportunities to learn more about the students, by the way, and learn more about what's really happening in the VE, and then think of ways to help them bridge those, fears or concerns or, differences in ways that would, help them build relationship, invest in the VE experiences. But again, at the end of the day, again, it's also lots of it is personality, identity, and interest of students. And again, it's always this question of how can I just help them in this limited period of time? How can I help them really learn more about each other? Some of the recent approaches that I've actually admired, and I would love to try that with college students because I've seen that in K-12 contexts, is to have students build the VE curriculum themselves. Like they would build tasks together, or like build curricula of their interest, where they could even, build tasks where they get to know each other and do, X, Y, and Z. And then, kind of integrate the learning objectives with the help of the instructors. I haven't seen that in college contexts yet, but I think it would be interesting to try that out, for instance. And obviously, because it's technology, because it's challenges with technology, it's not that easy to really see a VE, extending over like 7 weeks. But that would, I think I've seen like a couple of studies where they were following students, like connecting for a year, like a full year course. I haven't read those yet because they're recent, but I think it'll be also interesting to see like what really then happens to students if they connect via technology for this really long period of time.
So our next person to pose a question or make a comment is Ruth Kevis-Cohen.
Because you used English as a lingua franca in your study, I was wondering about the language levels of the students. In your experience with these students, were there significant differences in English language levels that influence their ability to communicate with the other students? And how did that affect the process?
So within each group, there was especially, I would say, groups 4 and 3, actually, and 2. I had a participant in each of these groups whose proficiency level was notably lower than the other students. And I think this is where it was interesting to see how then the other group members used, let's say, code switching and linguistic accommodation to support and accommodate their members. I wouldn't say that, at least in those 4 groups, there was a situation where not being advanced in English impacted the communication. Actually, I think it was the opposite. I think because students, and they actually said it to themselves and, sorry, to each other in the groups, that we're all here English learners. It's okay to make mistakes. We all learn from each other. They made that really clear in some groups to one another. They were very patient with one another. So that was really not the biggest challenge. But I think it's just the way they, approached, as I said, let's say code switching, for instance. In group 4, they just wanted to stick to English, nothing else. And, that's why, for instance, that the Janine member, I think, maybe one of the reasons why she did not, respond to them much was because they did not accommodate her use of Arabic, especially on the WhatsApp. While in other groups, that did not seem to be an issue that, hindered interaction and communication. The evidence shows actually that that's why they invested a lot in clarification, let's say, and, confirmation practices, which was also, interesting to see. In some groups, they vocally, shared empathy and solidarity with one another as, English language learners, especially that their first week task, they recorded this kind of what they call the autobiography English language journey, where they shared with one another how they were, English language learners and the challenges, opportunities. And this is where some of them chose to talk about, some of the intercultural issues they face. So I hope this answers the question.
Next up is Duncan Chargers.
I very much appreciated your presentation. And for me, I happen to be president of the Universal Esperanto Association right now. And the last year, we've been really focused on intercultural training. I've given about 7 or 8 different seminars with other people who are interested. One criticism of the Esperanto movement is it tends to remain at the superficial level in our conversations. So people are not really getting down in depth, because if they find conflict, they want to avoid it. And I think this is something that we really need to work on, so that we can confront each other, yes, as you mentioned, but this is not just to go into 2 monologues where we're not listening to each other. So I think that it would be interesting for other people who are interested in Esperanto to confirm or not whether they feel this is a problem. But one problem has been that if Esperanto is not being used in order to get better intercultural understanding in depth, then it really doesn't have any point. And so I think that if you can just confirm that we're on the right direction in trying to get people more aware that they don't really understand very much if they just choose to speak the same language.
Of course.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, definitely. Definitely. I guess, again, from just observing those very small groups of mine, and obviously I cannot generalize because, it's a very small study, but sometimes, translanguaging, using different languages will help you deepen the interaction more than just using one language, which I saw at least in 2 of my groups out of the 12 that I've seen and observed in this virtual exchange. Because it also, particularly when you discuss intercultural issues, controversial issues, things like occupation or war, you start learning not just like words and how things are said in another language, but you start, negotiate meaning around what those, the symbolic meaning of those words, right? Just to give you an example, and in group 1, students, for instance, when they were talking to Lubna, the Palestinian student, they started to appreciate some concepts like sumud, which now is a very pretty much, maybe if you're following the situation in Gaza, that's a very, very important concept in the Palestinian history, and that is, steadfastness and like being just resisting whatever comes to you. They started to appreciate concepts like that just by better understand. And she just kept using the word sumud, and she tried to explain it, and she just kept using it. So I think it could be as simple as individual words, but I think the attitude of making the use of other languages organic and natural in human speech and like human interaction is definitely important to then better understand their beliefs and, you know, their worldviews, I would say. And I think it's very important, especially when we work with students, younger students, college students, to bring those linguistic resources, you know, to their conversations, because this is how we affirm that this is part of their identity and hybrid identity. I always tell them, I sound different in Arabic. My sense of humor in Arabic is different than English, for instance. Those are very much important to bring to a conversation. Even if you do not fully understand Arabic, for instance, I think that's the beauty of technology these days, that if you have access to certain tools, if you have access to other humans, just like happened in the study, then, you know, the conversation would become more natural if we then have this awareness of, you know, that this is part of who I am, this is part of my conversation, and it's okay to bring it, and it's okay to try to navigate, you know, any conversation I have using it. I hope this answers your question, but I definitely agree with you. I definitely confirm this. And it's not easy. I know it's not easy. Like, I think even those who are trying to apply translanguaging, they don't always do it really the way that it's meant to be. So it's definitely a practice, and it's definitely, something we need to keep reflecting on as practitioners and also as teachers with our students.
And no, that's good. So becoming aware of the languages and cultural background of the other people is something that's crucial, and that be a part of the conversation and getting to know them and understanding others' identities. So just to thank you. I think we can conclude on that one, but I appreciate your comments.
Of course, thank you so much.
Let's move on to Jonathan Poole.
Yeah, hi. The first thing I thought about when I saw your description of the study was the methodology, and I noticed it was observational, and it started me asking myself, could a similar study be done experimentally, manipulating independent variables like asynchronous versus synchronous communication, or one language versus translated communication, or the task? And as you described the behavior of the participants in the group, I became more and more doubtful that experimental manipulations could actually work, because people seem to be you describe your participants as sort of doing whatever they wanted, regardless of the conditions that were imposed on them. So that leaves me wondering, do you anticipate there are variables that could be experimentally manipulated in order to sort of pin down the causality of intercultural competence?
I think that's a very important question. I guess maybe also because of the time limit, I wasn't able to go through things in detail, but I guess the dynamic factors, when you think of them when you break them down, for instance, one of the dynamic factors obviously was the use of synchronous and asynchronous digital tools. I compare, for instance, groups that chose to use only synchronous versus groups that used the combination of both. And even I looked at how those tools were used, and, for what reason and for what purpose, and, how effectively then this helped them, let's say, effectively interact or finish a task, for instance. So that was something I try to look at. Language, I think, because it was mainly English as a lingua franca, I tried, as I said, like, to look at how, so basically within each group, for instance, like students who were kind of had better English than other students, how did they work with that particular situation? Again, if there was strategies used to, even from those who basically, we might perceive as weaker in English. For instance, in one group, there was one student who still, was very determined into taking part and collaborating and interacting and asking questions. And for instance, you see that she used a lot of clarification, confirmation practices. She relied on her other Jordanian partner, for instance, for code switching and translation. She asked for it. And then others actually, then kept using it. there was, for instance, accommodation of asynchronous, like the chat in Zoom, in another group, because they knew kind of that their, other partner might, find it useful if they speak a bit, in a faster pace than she expects. So those are the things I really managed to look at, if that answers your question. I think one of the things that were difficult in the study, as you can imagine, is that I was very surprised and shocked by the lack of instructor facilitation in this VE. And it really took me a while to kind of, reorient myself around the data and how I can then look at the data. Because exactly as you said, students, they only knew what they need to do, the deadline, and they were obviously given instructions. But there was no facilitation, no even direct and formal mention of interculturality or the intercultural aspect of the language practice and learning they did. So everything that happened was very organic and very, kind of natural. So within the time frame and within the ability and within also the context of the study, I tried my best to kind of look at those dynamic factors as the way you described, somehow, not exactly, just to better understand, how this casuality, right, was formed. And that's why I keep using the word formed rather than co-constructed, at least when I talk about my findings, because lots of that just happened organically and naturally without planning. I hope this answers the question. And if you have any suggestions, I'm happy to, receive those in private comments or comment in the chat. That would help me also, look at the data differently after I finish the dissertation if I, want to comprehend things differently.
Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to move on to our second presenter of the day, Vito Miao, who has very different kind of research that he will present to us, and I'm really intrigued with what his study has shown. So please take it away, Vito.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Vito Miao, and I appreciate everyone for navigating different time zones to join this webinar. And I'm going to present my dissertation investigating the effect of social psychology and accent familiarity training on listener perception and comprehension of global English's varieties. So in this dissertation, I used an intervention approach that incorporated both socio-psychological theories and accent familiarity trainings to change people how they perceive global English speakers and how they are able to understand different accent varieties. And I wanted to mention that I have just finished this PhD dissertation, and I've just graduated from my home university. And I'm also excited to announce that I will be joining Texas Tech University as an assistant professor of applied linguistics starting August. And now let's move on. This dissertation is jointly funded by 3 different agencies: Marjorie Boulton Fellowship, Language Learning Dissertation Grant, and Support for Graduate Student Award from Northern Arizona University. And I am really grateful for the Marjorie Boulton Fellowship that I received. I saw an advertisement of this fellowship a year before I applied, and back then I was conceptualizing my dissertation, and I thought this would be such a relevant fellowship to apply to. And 1 year after, I proceeded to apply, and here I am. I'm very, very grateful. So some background information to my dissertation. English nowadays is spoken as a global lingua franca used by speakers of English as a first language and speakers of English of additional languages. This means that there are diverse global English's varieties being spoken: Chinese accented English, Japanese accented English, etc. However, research has consistently suggested that there's this listener perceptual bias against diverse English varieties. What does that mean? One of the theoretical approach in looking at this question is the linguistic stereotyping hypothesis, which holds that even brief samples of speech varieties associated with low prestige groups can cue negative attributions regarding individual speakers. That means that when we hear someone talk, without even looking at their face. We have some judgments about their personal quality, about their competence in performing a certain job. Indeed, research has supported that some of us found that people believe the second language learners or users are oftentimes perceived as less intelligent, less educated, less successful, and less credible. Some even found that, people who speak a second or foreign language, who speak English as second and foreign language, sounded boring, not engaging, and less qualified in certain professions. And this perceptual bias among against second language English speakers does not just exist in English as a first language speakers. English as a second language speakers are oftentimes also found to stigmatize their own or other L2 English accents. With these in mind, the goal of this dissertation is to try and implement an intervention or instruction, trying to mitigate listener perceptual bias, trying to improve mutual understanding, and trying to implement this intervention for both first and second language English speakers. The theoretical framework that I used in this dissertation is the cognitive dissonance theory. In this theoretical framework, cognition refers to one's thoughts, ideas, attitudes, and behaviors. And the idea of this theoretical framework is that when you are presented with two inconsistent cognitions, or when there is a cognitive dissonance, it'll create a psychological discomfort, which is a motivation for cognition change. And to give you an example to contextualize that, if I smoke cigarette and somebody comes and talked to me and said, oh, smoking cigarette is bad for your health, you're gonna get cancer, blah, blah, blah. And these two thoughts, or my behavior and what I was told, do not go well with each other. And this will make me keep thinking about it. And eventually I might change the way I think about smoking and its impact on my health, or I might quit smoking by changing my behavior. This means that cognitive dissonance could actually lead to attitudinal or behavioral changes, which is the theoretical foundation of this dissertation. So in this dissertation, I asked two research questions. What is the effect of a 2-week intervention on undergraduate students' linguistic stereotyping towards second language English speakers across the United States and China? And the second research question asked about the effect of the intervention on students' comprehension of different English accents. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm only going to focus on one of the research questions, but I am happy to talk about the findings of the second one, in case of interest. This research follows what's called the interrupted time series design. So we have one group of students, we implemented one pretest, and then 1 week after, another pretest, preceded by a 2-week intervention. And then we have an immediate post-test with a reflection component built in, and a delayed post-test 8 weeks after to test the longevity of any results that is observed from the study. There are two group of participants, each from the United States and China. In the United States, students were recruited from an introduction to sociolinguistic class. And in China, students were recruited from English as a foreign language class, and both of them are undergraduate level. And the intervention that happened in 2 weeks has a total of 6 sections, sessions each of about 15 minutes. So the first session is the cognitive dissonance intervention designed based on the cognitive dissonance theory. And then the second to sixth session each included an introduction of different English varieties. We have Indian accents, Chinese accents, Korean accents, Spanish accents. And I wanted to note that I used the word accents instead of the singular accent to indicate that, for example, Indian accent is not one monolithic thing. There are many sub-varieties of Indian accents, and we just use this umbrella term to acknowledge that there are many different Indian accents. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of what the cognitive dissonance intervention looked like. So in this intervention, in this session, I had students listen to different recordings. They're scripted, spoken by different speakers of different accent. Students listen to this different speakers, write words to describe the speakers, and together we look at the words together, trying to categorize them. And I'm going to play a recording that gives you an example.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags. We will go to meet her Wednesday at the train station.
So usually I play 3 recordings like this, usually a speaker from Edinburgh, a speaker from Hong Kong, and a speaker from Malaysia. And as students listen, they write words to describe the speakers, and together we try to categorize these words. And the resulting categories oftentimes are very interesting. We have words describing language use, for example, accented, intelligible, or not intelligible, not clear. We have words describing one's personal quality, like motherly, smart, hardworking, and bossy. We have words describing one's physical quality, buff, tall, beard, and Shrek. And we have words describing one's race, ethnicity, nationality, like Scottish, Chinese. And we have words associated with one's socioeconomic status, poor, living in the slums. And eventually we have words that have a cultural association or connotation, sheep, haggis, and curry. And note that these words came out even before students see the speaker's face. And in fact, the face were never shown to them. So these are the words that they came up with. Based on these words, we discuss issues relating to standard language ideology, ownership of English, correctness of English language use, English as a lingua franca, mutual responsibility in English as a lingua franca communication, language attitude and linguistic discrimination, and how this might have an undue influence on the individual second language English speaker and on the society as a whole. So the goal of this session is to create cognitive dissonance by presenting students with 2 thoughts or 2 cognitions. One of them that is that listeners, everyone in the classroom, we came up with all those words describing the second language speaker. This, to some extent, demonstrate that we have some perceptual biases against speakers of different varieties, and that this listener bias can have an undue influence on the individuals and on the society. And following the cognitive dissonance intervention, we have many different accent familiarity training, trying to improve people's understanding of different accents. So within each phonological training session, we provided a explicit instruction of phonological features of a specific variety. So for example, in Chinese accented English, people sometimes realize this particular sound as that. So instead of saying, for example, David, they might say something like David, inserting a schwa sound at the end. And some people will omit the word final consonant sound and instead say something like David without the D sound. And following the instruction of explicit instruction of phonological variety, we provided students with some listening exercises with a TED Talk featuring that particular variety, plus some comprehension questions to help students more meaningfully engaged with the text. And to collect perceptual data, we have 18 speech recordings representing American varieties, British varieties, and 14 different global Englishes varieties. And linguistic stereotyping in this study is operationalized using 4 items, each probing listener perceptual judgments of the speakers in terms of their intelligence level, education, success, and competence. And a sample question would look like this. To me, the speaker sounds, 1 is not intelligent at all, 9 is very intelligent. And beyond quantitative or numerical data, we also ask students to write a reflection essay at the end of the intervention, describing their overall experience and provide suggestions and feedback. And to analyze the quantitative or numerical data, to remind you, the research question is, what is the effect of a 2-week intervention on undergraduate students' linguistic stereotyping toward second language English speakers across the United States and China? And to answer this question, we used what's called the linear mixed effects model, using time, student, location to predict linguistic stereotyping. So in more layman term, this model allows us to see the effect of the intervention on changing people's linguistic stereotyping while controlling for student individuality and the geographic location that the students are in. And we're going to discuss the results based on this graph. Y-axis, or vertically, is a composite variable demonstrating linguistic stereotyping. Higher value means more favorable rating, and lower value means more negative rating. And the x-axis horizontally is time. We have pre-test 1, pre-test 2 before the intervention, and then post-test 1, post-test 2 after the intervention. And we're going to look at this graph together. So the first finding is there's no effects of location on students' linguistic stereotyping. This means that there's cross-contact generalizability of the results, regardless of whether the students took the course in China or the United States. The results did not differ significantly. And between pretest 1 and pretest 2, students demonstrated more linguistic stereotyping against Global English's varieties. And note that this happens before the intervention. And to interpret this, perhaps exposure to Global English's accents without necessarily knowing why in educational context might reinforce stereotypes. All of a sudden, when students are, for example, taking an English as a second language course, all of a sudden the teacher started talking about Indian accents, Chinese accents, Korean accents. Students might be confused and they're like, why are we doing this? This could potentially be the reason to explain the lower rating observed from the pretest compared to from the pretest 2 compared to the first pretest. However, between pretest 2 and post-test 1, students demonstrated significantly less linguistic stereotyping against Global English speakers. This means that there is a positive effect of the intervention on students' perception of Global English speakers. And between post-test 1 and post-test 2, students demonstrated further less linguistic stereotyping against Global English speakers, but this was not statistically significant. Although this could be used as evidence to support that the intervention effect is longitudinal. After 8 weeks, we can still see that the results or the gains were retained and they are on an upward trend. So something good for the teachers and researchers to think about. And turning to the qualitative findings or the nonverbal findings, overall, students' reflection essays demonstrated an increased level of awareness, acceptance, and confidence of different English varieties. And students were somehow led to reflect on the nature of communication and the relationship between having an accent and one's intelligence level. So here are some snapshots of the data that we have observed from the reflections. So the intervention raised awareness of issues relating to stereotyping. One student mentioned, "My eyes were truly opened to how simple it is to engage in language stereotyping without even being aware of it. It increased my awareness of my own prejudices and the steps I might take to overcome them." And notice that we use pseudonyms instead of participants' numbers to humanize our participants. And the intervention also led to some acceptance of Global English's varieties. And this is my favorite quote, not because it's so real. To be honest, I used to think that people with poor English pronunciation were learning the wrong version of English. I was discussing this with another coder, and the use of poor and wrong especially resonated with our experiences of students that are trying to accept a different accent. And now they mentioned that now I realize there was no right or wrong pronunciation of English. Different pronunciations didn't necessarily mean that they were incorrect. And the intervention also led to increased confidence of students' own varieties, with one student mentioned that being in this class made me realize that having an accent, and especially a Spanish accent, is part of who I am and makes me proud of being able to speak English and still represent my country and my language. And the intervention also led students to think about the symbiotic relationship between speakers and listeners in intercultural communication, with one student mentioning that I used to blame myself entirely for any communicational breakdowns due to my accent. Now I understand the reciprocal nature of constructing meaning across linguistic and cultural barriers. So they were asked to reflect on the nature of communication more as a two-way street, one that is co-constructed by both speakers and listeners. It used to be the case that whenever there's a communication breakdown between, for example, communication between first language English speakers and second language English speakers, oftentimes we take the blame. We have an accent. We are not understood. We weren't able to express our ideas clearly. And now they're really prompted to think about how communication is co-constructed by both listeners and speakers. One can have an accent doesn't necessarily mean that the other person could not understand them. And in the end, the intervention allowed students to conceptually disentangle one's accent from their personal qualities, such as intelligence. One person mentioned this wrong idea that people with accents are less smart could hurt the progress of new research. Lots of really smart people who could bring new ideas and research may never get the chance because of how they talk, and that holds back as a society. So we have observed that students are trying to parse out these two ideas, having an accent and being smart or being dumb. So to provide a summary of the findings from this dissertation, we've seen a positive effect of the intervention on mitigating students' linguistic stereotyping against global English speakers, and that this finding is longitudinal, 8 weeks after the intervention, and generalizable in both geographic context in China and in the United States. And qualitative findings suggested that the intervention improved students' awareness, acceptance, confidence in different English varieties, and asked them to reflect on the nature of communication as a two-way street, and help them parse out the relationship between having an accent and being intelligent or being less intelligent. The implication of this study is at least twofold. For second language acquisition, it provides provides a pedagogical model to help us reconceptualize English language classroom, one that acknowledges and incorporates different English varieties. And for intercultural communication, it somehow evidence the effectiveness of listener training programs. Oftentimes, like I said, when we examine intercultural communication or communicational breakdowns, we oftentimes blame the second language speakers. They are not able to speak clearly, they have an accent, etc., etc. And now a complementary approach is to train listeners to be better able to understand different English accents, to demonstrate less bias towards or against speakers of different accents. So this dissertation provides empirical evidence to support that listener training can be extremely effective, just as speaker training. Some of the limitations of this dissertation that I have to acknowledge. The first one of them is that we used self-reported measure of linguistic stereotyping. We asked students to basically mention on a 7-point, 9-point Likert scale, how smart do you think the speaker, how educated do you think they are? And students, by the end of the intervention, they could figure out the purpose of this research. So they might put on the Likert scale whatever they think their instructor want to see. So that could lead to bias in the findings. And another limitation is that we use the same recordings for pre-test and post-test. This, to some extent, controlled for the variance in terms of the speech stimuli that we provided to our listeners. However, students might get bored, they might get tired over and over again. Participant fatigue after listening to the same pre and post test every single time might lead to variance in terms of the results. And in the end, this study only investigated listener perception, how they self-reportedly perceive second language English speakers. And the question is, to what extent do these predict their behaviors? If I say on a 7-point Likert scale that I believe the speaker is smarter, more competent, more intelligent, in real world context, does that mean that we are going to behave more nicely to them? Does that mean that we are going to change our behaviors? Or is it just that we are putting things on a Likert scale without really changing our behaviors? So future studies is needed to explore the empirical link between perception and behaviors. And that is the end of my presentation. And I welcome any questions, thoughts, and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vito. That was very interesting. Once again, we will ask people to raise their hands virtually in the Zoom software. And the first name I see is Jonathan Poole.
Yeah, hi. That's a very interesting study. It reminds me of something I recall from 60 years ago when one of, at least as I recall it, one of the participants in this meeting, Duncan Charters, who had just immigrated to the United States from the UK and was working as an encyclopedia, door-to-door encyclopedia salesman, reported to me that he was phenomenally successful in selling encyclopedias, and he attributed his success to the fact that he had a British accent. And this, he can tell us whether I'm making it all up or it really happened. But at any rate, that reminds me that the same phenomenon exists intralingually in every language in the world, probably. There are regional, ethnic, racial, religious varieties, and there are stereotypes about them, and they're not only negative, they're also positive. So a lot of Americans, have a positive regard for some accents other than American. And within America, you have, Southern, Black vernacular English and so forth. So I'm wondering whether you couldn't generalize the study to intra as well as interlingual stereotypes and varieties.
Yeah, thank you so much for this comment. I think it is important to acknowledge that linguistic stereotyping hypothesis, I think when it's first proposed, it only indicates how varieties associated with low prestige groups can cue negative attributions, but indeed the reverse can happen. Varieties associated with perhaps higher prestige group can cue positive attributions of the speakers. And there are many instances where some people might favor a certain English accent, a certain native English accent, and some of them even romanticize a certain accent. Maybe, for example, one would say that French accented English sounds more elegant, etc. So I think, yes, this study is limited in that it doesn't necessarily investigate different regional varieties. But I do think the hope is that the results are somehow generalizable, that ask students to reflect that having an accent, each person speaks differently, and having an accent doesn't necessarily mean that a person is superior or inferior to another.
Our next question comes from the encyclopedia salesman extraordinaire, Duncan Charters.
I don't think I was that successful, but there's certainly some truth about that because I was trained to say certain kinds of things that would sound also British. And that's the positive side, of course, of speaking still with a British accent in the United States. But the negative side of that is that I found in my teaching that very often people pay less attention to the content of what I'm saying and more to the fact that I'm saying it in a different accent. So I don't know if you run across that, but I found that as a pretty big negative, and I have to be very aware of that in my explanations and so how I'm interacting with other people. It is interesting, the prestige, because I have a cousin who taught business in Madrid in Spain, and he said all the students wanted to be taught by British teachers, and so he asked them, well, who are you going to do business with? Oh, United States. But you need some American teachers, so you get familiar with listening to American accents. Oh, no, 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 British English is much better. And so that I think has evolved and changed over the years a bit. But nonetheless, it does show the prejudice can go in that other direction too. But that was my experience, that I have to be careful that people are listening to what I actually say.
Yeah, that leads me to think about the intergroup hypothesis, where at first, when two groups or two different people interact with each other, some of the first things that picked out from, for example, the way you speak, the way you look, and they oftentimes make snap judgments, trying to put you in different categories. And that perhaps explains your experience of how people tend to focus more on the way you speak and not necessarily the things being communicated, which is unfortunate. And well, let's I don't know. I haven't really looked into this phenomenon in my dissertation, but I think it would be a fascinating one. To what extent do people perceive, or do people focus on the content beyond one's accent as a result of any sort of intervention or training? That would be a fascinating question to explore, or a follow-up to this dissertation.
Yeah, and I think learning to listen to others too, that's something I think in the Esperanto community, it's the same thing. So where you really we probably need some training in that too for people with very different accents, so people don't run away from someone with an Asian accent because they're not understanding them well enough. So this is all fascinating. So thanks so much for your response.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, I'm going to place myself in the question queue here with a related topic. I think many Americans have a positive view of certain kinds of British accents, particularly those portrayed in Hollywood movies, and to a lesser extent, British movies, as the good guys, the wealthy guys, the cultured guys. Those are all positive things about the way many Americans think about a British, that specific British accent. And some percentage of us have acquired, I think, with less foundation and more reliance on Hollywood, negative impressions of some other British accents, Cockney being the one that is often chosen by movie makers to be the low class, the untrustworthy, the possible criminal, that sort of thing. So that gives two poles that Americans absorb rather artificially from Hollywood mostly. We would have to consider, how do Americans react to an accent that they don't recognize and can't place to any country or any social level. And I would imagine that they might choose or might form unconsciously a mental bias that says this is even worse than the negative one, the Cockney one. Or perhaps alternatively, I don't know what this is. I have a more neutral experience, and I'll put it in the middle between the Cockney and the higher class British. Do you have an opinion of how an unrecognized accent might be interpreted in terms of positive or negative by some of the
That
students
is,
that you worked with?
yeah, this is a very interesting comment, and two things I wanted to echo to. One of them is that you mentioned it is very true that media portrayal, accents, different accents used in movies will have an effect on people's perception. If, for example, one particular accent is always associated with the devils or the bad guys, then people speaking, that variety will automatically be perceived as, they're usually the bad guys, even though they might not have interacted with each other in real life. And another question is oftentimes, like you mentioned, it is a very clear intention that when people hear a different accent, one of the first things they do is trying to place them in categories. What is that accent? Is that something that I am familiar with? Is that something that I am unfamiliar with? And I think that is a legitimate point. Perhaps it would be easier to process the world when things are put into categories. And I do not necessarily have an answer to your question, how people would perceive unrecognizable accent. My impression is perhaps people will put them in the wrong box. When I collect students' little piece of paper on, words describing the speakers, we can often see wrong countries or wrong geographic locations being identified. For example, the Scottish accent, which to me was very clearly Scottish. Some people might put, French, European, Russian, etc. So sometimes I believe if people do not recognize this type of accent, they might just make a guess, and they might draw other contextual cues. For example, the way you look. For example, they might have an easier time guessing my English accent simply by the way I look. And with just audio files only, it might be more tricky.
Our next question comes from Brandon, but thank you for that answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Derek, your comment and question made me think also of what I could easily imagine similar things happening in the US with other American English accents, right? Like I can imagine in some parts of the US that a thick Southern English accent would be carry negative stereotypes with it, even perhaps compared to like a global English accent, from someone who's speaking English as an additional language.
I agree. And I think part of it is also due to how perhaps television shows portray these accents. Sometimes they put a perhaps less educated character, specifically with a Southern accent. So people might think, oh, if you're from the South, maybe you're less educated. I even, during one of my campus interviews with Texas Tech, with a student worker, we interacted and they asked about my research. And he said, yeah, I speak a Southern accent. And when people speak a Southern accent, sometimes I just think maybe they're less smart, but even though I also speak that variety. So I thought that was a very interesting phenomenon.
Thank you. All right, our last question in queue is Marcia.
Hi, thank you so much, Vito, for that very interesting research. I wanted to follow up on one of your comments towards the end where you say that maybe one of the limitations of your study may be that students kind of imagine what what they should be answering towards the end. And I was kind of thinking that as you were explaining your research, so I was thinking, well, did they learn, maybe the one thing they learned from this is that, that stereotypes are bad and they shouldn't have them. And therefore they're going to answer the post test differently. And I was just wondering if you've given any thought about how you might address that, if you were able to, follow up, or like how might you address that problem?
That is an excellent question. And I am collaborating with my dissertation chair, and we are conceptualizing a study on addressing it. So to give you some more information, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the Harvard Implicit Association Test. So basically, it asks you snap judgments, yes and no, ask you to associate, for example, African American looking faces with positive words and negative words versus white presenting Caucasian faces with positive words and negative words. And I think the speed that you associate with one group's being good or one group's being bad is indicator of your potential bias. And that is something that people simply cannot lie about, because it is more like it's more you make
Like a
snap
reflex.
judgments in make snap judgment in milliseconds. And a group of scholars from Northumbria University in the UK have adapted this to explore implicit bias against regional varieties within the United Kingdom. And that is one of the approach that I might look into to somehow replicate and somehow validate to capture people's more subconscious judgments that in a more, I don't know, more sneaky way, something that they cannot lie about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I was also thinking about the other comments that came after that about the content, paying attention to the accent more than the actual content. And I wonder if a prompt following when the students are listening to the recordings, something that asks them to either summarize or react somehow to the actual content of what the speakers are saying and not just pay attention to I wonder if that would change anything. Anyway, I think it's fascinating study, and I thank you for it, and I'm still thinking about it. So
Thank you so much. And regarding your last comment, I've seen people doing priming and investigated the effect of priming on their perception or comprehension of different English speakers. So what they did was they sometimes ask you to imagine, if you speak a second language, when you speak a second language, what happens? Or to put yourself into their shoes as an immigrant, as a second language English speakers in the US. What is their daily life? Like, what do they do, etc. And those primings, even though they can be very, very short, has an effect on people's perceptual judgment. But the longevity of the effect is still uncertain. So we don't know if you're primed for 5 minutes and the next 10 minutes you provide more favorable rating. How long does it last is another question. But that's a very, very lovely comment, and I would be interested in looking into it a little more.
This is a comment on Hiba's presentation. I really appreciated your emphasizing of culture as dynamic and not static, and the importance of interculturality. And I thought that this is very relevant as something to think about in the Esperanto movement, or the relevance that Esperanto can have. Some of our, there's different ideas and conceptions about the role that Esperanto can play. And, there's some people who talk about Esperanto as being an interlanguage, that our literature is an interliterature, right? So that it's not something that is fixed, and, that we're our own closed sect speaking this language, but that actually the value that Esperanto has is providing this non-static and dynamic bridge across cultures, across literatures, right, across national boundaries. So it was, again, just observation. I really appreciated your focus and conceptualization of that in your presentation.
Well, thank you. Actually, this is something maybe you guys want to consider or talk about at some point. Maybe an idea of a virtual exchange of the speakers of a language as a way of showing solidarity, or spreading awareness about why you speak it and how you speak it and for what purpose might be a good idea to invest in at some point. But no, thank you so much, Brandon, for your comment.
All right. Well, I will once again say how much I enjoyed both presentations and the lively discussions afterwards. So thanks to all who participated, all who presented, and we will see you. We will announce it sometime in September. We will have a similar ESF Connected live session with hopefully similarly interesting content. Thank you.
And thanks to you, Derek, for hosting this. And also a thank you to Chelsea Moses, who put this all together, who could not be here because it was 1:30 in the morning. She's in Vietnam right now. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.